The word conflict gets used a lot in the startups that I work with. And usually it's referring to any number of things, which might be small verbal disagreements, a little bit of frustration, tension, or really dysfunctional relationships. But if you don't have a precise definition of what co-founder conflict actually is, then it's going to be really difficult to identify when it's happening to you and your team, and therefore make it more difficult for you to take effective, decisive action to fix it. So today, I want to give you a more clinical definition of co-founder conflict, one that's based in psychology rather than startup mythology. And that way, whenever you're starting to feel it, you can pinpoint it and eliminate it at the root cause rather than just putting some operational Band-Aid on something that has relational roots. So with that said, my name is Dr. Matthew Jones. I'm a licensed psychologist and co-founder coach. I've been working exclusively with startup co-founding teams for the last 6+ years of all different types of industries. And my entire mission is to demystify this relationship so that you and your co-founder can grow together and scale along with your organization so that you can take it to where you want to. So the word conflict, I think we need to start defining with a little bit more rigor. So what I do in my book, The Co-Founder Effect, is I go to the Latin roots of this word. And so conflict breaks down into two different Latin roots. The first one is con, meaning together, and figere, meaning to strike. So you put con figere together, and what you get is to strike together, right? To clash, to fight. And the reason I really appreciate this definition is that there's a sense of togetherness in it. So whether you like it or not, you and your co-founder are being kind of struck together, right? So it's a relational dynamic. There's this implied sense of this being something that is interpersonal going on between the two of you. And so if you're kind of being struck together, whether that's kind of inter-team, or you guys are striking against the external market forces and other hardships that you're going to encounter as you scale, there is a sense of togetherness. So whether you like it or not, you guys are in this together. And whether it becomes something that is generative for your startup that leads to more effective decision-making and better execution, or starts to derail your ability to grow and scale the company that you want, it really depends on whether or not you're able to identify and address it effectively. So I want to transition into a more clinical definition. So that's just looking at the Latin roots, but let's get in a little bit more detail. As I define it in the co-founder effect, co-founder conflict specifically is a relational misalignment between two or more founders, resulting in conscious and unconscious distress for one or more team members. So I was very particular with this definition, and believe it or not, there is no pre-existing definition of co-founder conflict. So I'm the first one to actually define it. Not that I'm bragging, it's needed. To me, it's an obvious oversight. And so I've defined it in that way, and I want to break down this definition a little bit further to walk you through how I think about this as a clinical psychologist. So the first piece of this is relational misalignment. The purpose of this phrase is to highlight that co-founder conflict, it's not simply a business level disagreement. It's not just about maybe disagreeing on strategy or hiring decisions or product roadmap. Like that all can happen without it contributing to what I would define as co-founder conflict. While those can lead to it, the key facet is that it has to be relational misalignment. So if, for example, you are disagreeing on the product roadmap, just as an example, and you are doing so persistently, what you'll notice is if it's just about the product roadmap itself, you might walk away and feel frustrated, but very quickly you're able to switch to the next topic, the next conversation, the next decision, and you're not going to notice much emotional residue. However, if you start telling yourself kind of negative stories about the other person's actions, if you start building a case for why they themselves as individuals are problematic, or something to that effect, that's whenever it goes from a tactical or strategic business level issue into a domain of psychological and emotional, interpersonal, relational misalignment. And so that's the key distinction I'm trying to make. And when that happens, the business disagreement takes on more meaning that is it becomes psychologically charged. So there's unmet emotional needs, eroded trust, unspoken expectations about how the other person can show up. And that's where this starts to get a little bit tricky. And so then the second part I want to highlight is that I named both conscious and unconscious distress because, yes, there are times where you might say, and if I were to give you a checklist, you might check, yes, I feel frustrated with my co-founder. But oftentimes, this can show up unconsciously, such as like, you feeling a little bit more stressed throughout the day, through you having difficulty falling asleep because you're replaying an argument about, whatever the product roadmap that you had with your founder earlier that day. Or you might notice displacement. So showing up shorter with more tension with your friends, your family, your dog, whatever the case may be, due to the stress in this primary relationship. And so you don't have to acknowledge it consciously and say, oh yeah, I'm dealing with this challenge with my co-founder for it to be affecting you emotionally, psychologically, interpersonally. And so I wanted to highlight that as well, because it can also often start in these very subtle forms before it really starts to impact you and you acknowledge that I'm having and experiencing co-founder conflict, which as a label might also feel a little bit threatening and existential, given the fact that it's the most important relationship in your entire business. And is the only business relationship, by the way, that is both responsible for your team's floor and ceiling of execution and can simultaneously end the entire business, right? So it is an important one. And so I think that's worth mentioning as well. So what I want to talk about next is when disagreements lead into conflict, right? Because I have founders who will come to me and say, hey, Matt, like, is it supposed to be this hard? Like, damn, this is really challenging. And the truth is that where you have your own pain threshold, co-founder to co-founder, really varies. And so I see some teams who have high degrees of pain tolerance, and they say, yeah, this is within normal bounds. I'm game to keep working on this. And others who have a much lower threshold and say, there's no way this is going to work, I'm done. And so I have co-founders often ask me, like, Matt, is this just hard? Is this just a hard relationship to manage? Or is it a sign that we need to end things? And so if you ever approach that, what I want to highlight is the content of your disagreement doesn't matter as much as the process. So for example, you can argue about product roadmap. You can argue about maybe someone's performance that feels lackluster. That difference is meaningful, but less significant than the process of how those arguments go. So for example, if you're arguing about product roadmap and all of a sudden you guys are yelling at one another, or one person kind of leaves and doesn't talk to you for 2 days, yeah, I mean, like, again, you can make a difference. Like maybe that content is slightly different or less invasive than the piece around, the performance-based feedback. However, if you're escalating and demonstrating those stonewalling, defensiveness, some of those 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that we'll talk about soon, then that is more the problem. The process is more important and more problematic than the content. And so that's another shift I want all of you to make, is understanding it's less about what we're arguing about. That matters, but what matters more is how we are engaging with one another in conflict. And so if we're able to disagree about any number of things in a healthy and productive manner, where each person feels heard and understood because we have a really clear framework and SOP for how to handle it, then that is far more emblematic of a healthy and flexible and adaptive partnership. Whereas if you don't have those same features, if it's more rigid and you're noticing more of those challenging patterns showing up, then that's whenever you might have something that is more insidious and systemic you guys need to address as a team. Where this leads me is the 3 languages that all teams speak. So this came from a clinical observation after working with hundreds of founders for the last 6 years, where I started to notice these recurring patterns where we might be arguing about something in the business, but really what we weren't naming are the unspoken emotional dynamics that were influencing our argument. Let me give you an example. I once worked with a clinical psychologist who said to me, Matt, whenever a couple comes in and they're arguing about the dishes, it's not about the dishes. It's about something else, something deeper, something that would require greater vulnerability for them to name and articulate. And if only you can get them to go from that surface disagreement on how to load the dishwasher into those unspoken emotional and relational dynamics, all of a sudden the dishes won't matter. And it's completely true, because this is true in my relationship, because I get very frustrated with my wife. I'm like, listen, you're not loading this up the right way. I have to take it all out and undo it. And I don't give a shit about that if we're in a good relational space. I only care about it if I am harboring other resentments and frustrations that have compounded. And so what I want you to notice is this. Here's the model. The three languages that all teams speak are operational, psychological, and archetypal. And I want you to think about this as an iceberg. So picture the iceberg that sank the Titanic for a second. What you will notice is operational language, which is the default language of most founders, is only a very small proportion of the total iceberg. Okay? Hold that thought. Operational language, as I said, is the default language of most founding teams. It is fast, it's rapid back and forth communication style. It doesn't take much cognitive load or emotional difficulty to have these conversations. This is, as you guys are talking about KPIs, OKRs, your ROAS, whatever the case may be in the business aspect of things, very light lift to do. Psychological language, on the other hand, is slower, more deliberate, more resource intensive. It requires a fundamentally different posture toward listening than operational language does. Operational language, you might be able to multitask. I see this all the time in founders. You're typing, you're responding to a Slack message, you're talking about the business. You can do all of that because it's a very light and easy cognitive load. What it becomes more challenging is whenever you're having a more psychological conversation about emotions, about interpersonal dynamics, it requires a different mode of listening and engaging so that you and the other person develop a sense of attunement to one another that helps you feel heard and understood. And this is a skill that most founding teams don't have, or they don't have the right tools and frameworks to do this effectively. The last piece is archetypal language. This is the language of the unconscious, what psychoanalysis would call inner subjectivity, what you might think of as just the vibe. Right? Like if you've been a part of a high-performing team, you recognize how infectious that energy is. It's 1 + 1 = 5. By definition, this is a synergistic effect where you guys are rowing the same direction at the same cadence, and that is so enlivening to be a part of a team like that. On the flip side, we have all experienced relationships that go through moments of hardship, where all of a sudden you receive a text or a Slack message and your stomach kind of knots up. You're like, oh God, like here's that person again. In this case, your co-founder. I want to make sure I say the right words here. I'm kind of walking on eggshells. Everybody knows what that feels like too, and that doesn't feel good. But whether you're on the positive side of this synergistic interaction or the negative polarity of it, either way, that is informing you and giving you really important data about the health and the state of the partnership. So that's important information. And so I really encourage you through psychological language to be able to name and articulate those unspoken elephants in the room that come from the archetypal dynamics, because your body is giving you very important information. So when we spend the majority of our time arguing about something operational, we create a mismatch. Because if we're experiencing co-founder conflict, as I defined earlier, that does have to do with relational dynamics, those unspoken emotional pieces, whether those are unmet expectations or issues like power and how we're agreeing or disagreeing to the power structure, whether that's degrees of sacrifice and commitment that creates some upset, or feeling like we're not recognized for our contribution or appreciated in that manner, or maybe we're arguing because one of us wants more autonomy than the other, and this can obviously bleed into decision-making rights and those types of things. If we don't get into those conversations that go beneath the surface, to name those unspoken emotional dynamics, to name the feeling of being disempowered or not recognized in the manner that we hope, then it's almost impossible to fix it operationally. So I'll have teams come to me for work where they've tried to engage in changing roles and responsibilities or titles, but it either hasn't worked or that those conversations didn't go well because they weren't able on their own to have the right space and tools to name the psychological and archetypal dynamics that were actually at the core root that required them to then think, hey, we need an operational solution. So that's the mismatch. The mismatch is you're using the wrong language, the wrong set of tools to solve this problem. And so that's why co-founder coaching really exists, is to help teams get to those deeper layers. And the challenge is, if you're not working on those deeper layers, this starts to compound, right? Like the Gottman Institute talks about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So if you haven't heard about that, those are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. And those don't just show up in marriages, those show up in any attachment-based relationship, which your relationship with your co-founder certainly is. And that can start to erode trust at the very foundation of the most important relationship in your business. What that means for you personally is you are at minimum, your defenses are up. You're exerting more energy to keeping some of these thoughts and fears, because it is an existential concern, out of your mind so that you can continue executing, which depletes your resources, contributes to burnout, contributes to you not showing up as well in other facets of your life. And so there's a meaningful personal cost here. Then there's also the kind of cost relationally, where you might vent to friends, family, whatever the case may be. And so then they're absorbing some of that stress. This is, by the way, what you call a spillover and crossover effect, where you bring work home emotionally, and that creates more dysfunction, and also dysfunction in the home you bring into work. Very challenging dynamic that we observe in marital research. And my guess and my theory is it absolutely happens within this relationship. We just don't have enough research. I'm working to change that. Obviously this starts to impact the business, right? Because if you followed me thus far, there is no way you can tell me this is not impacting how you make decisions, how you operate, how you coordinate, how you communicate. It's at the very center of this entire company. And by the way, your employees notice. And that ripple effect starts to really take hold of entire organizations if you don't address it early. So here's what I'll tell you. If any of this seems interesting, if you want to nerd out a little bit more about this, or you want to understand more of the specific emotional unspoken dynamics, those unconscious vibes, I break all of that down, in particular in part 2 of the book. Part 1 has more of the definition and a lot more kind of high-level insight. And then part 3 is the most highly actionable ways for you and your co-founder to make meaningful progress on co-founder conflict without the use of a coach. And so please do check that out. It's available on Amazon. I will link that below. And in the next video, I'm hopeful to get into a little bit more depth about what the co-founder effect actually is, and why this relationship with your co-founder is the single most under-examined and most important variable to your startup's success.